Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. I'm Joseph Bohegan. That was an excerpt of Gestern by our guest today, Lars Petter Hagen. Hagen's music has been called an art of resignation, silent despair, and reduction, and he describes himself as melancholic. But if all this suggests a man in retreat from society, Lars Petter Hagen's career suggests quite the opposite. As a composer, he has attracted international acclaim for his work, which maintains a unique and questioning stance towards the great musical milestones of the past. The UK's Gramophone magazine describes him as essentially swearing in church, at the same time as crafting the most heavenly sounds this side of the pearly gates, and describing his 2014 album with symphonic music performed by the Oslo Philharmonic as genuinely visionary, the most important new music disc to arrive for a long time. Thanks for joining me, Lars Petter.
Thanks for inviting me. Great to be here.
I wanted to start off by asking you about one of your recent pieces, Gestern. The title is borrowed from a memoir from 1934 by Stefan Zweig, Die Welt von Gestern. What's the connection with that book?
Well, it's a book that has fascinated me for a long time, and I read it some years ago, and it made a deep impression at that time. I mean, it's an autobiography by the writer Stefan Zweig. He was an intellectual who lived in a Jewish intellectual, lived in Vienna from late 1800, and then he committed suicide during the Second World War. And his story is extremely moving on a personal level, but it's also super interesting. And that's maybe what made the greatest impression on me at that time is the description. The way he describes Europe at the end of the 18th century, with all the different art directions coming together, all the different intellectual schools, this extremely creative environment. And then the road into disaster, first the World War One, and then eventually the World War Two and the Holocaust and this tragedy of Europe. And what made an impression on me was that he described Europe in a way that at that time he said that his parents, they had experienced the longest period of peace in their country in many years. So it was a very privileged in a way and wealthy situation for many people in Austria at the time and in Europe at the time. And nobody expected anything bad to happen. And then from out of nowhere, they were suddenly part of the World War One, and they didn't really realize that before the young soldiers, the young boys started to come back from the battlefield, without legs and arms and with severe injuries. And then suddenly it was visible to everybody that wow, we are actually in a war. And then from there it was just a long tragic development, and we know the end of that tragic development. So, and in a way I felt a little bit the same about the world situation. I guess there was so much insecurity, and the world as it had felt extremely stable to me, and then we suddenly had a political situation, and not at least in the US, with a political situation with Donald Trump at the time, and suddenly everything seemed possible, and it scared me, and so I it made a deep personal impression on me, that book. But it was also appealing to me. In terms of the format, this reflective format, the autobiography format, where his starting point is himself, his childhood, his family history, and all the different meetings he had during his youth and during his all the artists he met, and this nostalgia and this melancholic feeling in the novel was very. It appealed to me, and it felt like something I could relate to. And then I realized at some point, because I've always been almost obsessed, with yesterday, which is the title in a way. I guess then it's the German word for yesterday. And I was always almost had this strong interest in history, strong interest in the relationship between the tradition and the contemporary. And I guess this is what people sometimes call the melancholic aspect in my music. It's this kind of reflection on the past, which I'm very often dealing with in my music. And what I discovered was that Stefan Zweig, he was a music lover, and he knew a lot of composers, he knew a lot of musicians, and he collected scores. So he had a big personal collection of original manuscripts from great composers like Bach and Weber, Busoni, Edvard Grieg, Mozart, and these manuscripts, they were donated to the British Library, and they are all there. They are available for the public through the internet now. So that became a starting point of the composition, the personal manuscript collection of Stefan Zweig. So I quote some of these manuscripts and in the piece, and so it's kind of like a collage of material.
Yeah, I heard there was a quotation from the Bach cantata Herr Gott, dich loben alle wir. Was that one of the manuscripts?
It was, yeah, for sure, yeah. And also the first part, the opening with the strings, that's the viola part, which she also had, Herr Gott, dich loben alle wir, but only the viola part. So I had kind of reorchestrated the viola part, and I expanded it a little bit some places, and then it ends up with the chorale.
Yeah, I remember singing that melody in church actually growing up. I grew up in an Armenian church, but that was the one non-Armenian song that we sang every week.
Okay, fantastic.
So that melody really stuck out to me. I was like, wait, I know what that is, and I had to look it up.
Great. Fantastic.
Let's listen now to an excerpt of Lars Petter Hagen's Gestern in a recording by Norwegian radio NRK from the Ultima Festival, performed by Klangforum Wien. That was Lars Petter Hagen's Gestern, performed by Klangforum Wien. I know a lot of your works deal with memory and musical memory. When did that start for you, and how has it evolved over the course of your work?
That's a good question. I'm not sure which piece was the first one, but I don't know. For me, composition was always connected to reflection somehow. And this to experience music is obviously to, through your memory, try to organize what you hear. I mean, your brain tries to create patterns based on what you just heard and try to predict what will happen next in a way. So that's kind of the psychology of musical perception, is in a way about memory. And I have, at least from, I guess I started as when I was a student, I wrote music in a quite maybe something you could call neo-serial tradition, or kind of new complex, but not extremely complex. But it was very inspired by composers like Brian Ferneyhough and people like that. And then, but at that time, it was the sounds I was interested. I was interested in the musical textures, the direct expression, the kind of extreme expression. But then I also realized that the modernist tradition and also the new complexity tradition and all the people I admire, they very often it was kind of the pieces I liked, like the Etude Transcendentale by Ferneyhough. I mean, or any Boulez piece. They were very often directly related to historical repertoire and the Western tradition, and there was some kind of dialogue with this tradition in a very very specific way, not just like but in a very very specific way, and for me it was a big discovery when I realized that the modernist movement, in many ways, that it is very often presented as like a break. People who wanted to break, like a complete break with the tradition. For me, it is in a way the opposite. It's a music that comes out of desperation in a way after and after the World War One, and in particular also World War Two. They needed to find a new language that was disconnected from tradition, so they needed to find new ways of creating music that was not connected to the human will, because the human will had proved to be too weak, because it had allowed Holocaust, and this is also the Adorno kind of question. So what kind of literature and what kind of music, what kind of art can we make after Holocaust? And that serial music that was created in Darmstadt in the 50s and 60s were in a way answered to that, and it has been presented as like a complete break with the tradition. But for me, it's very clear now in retrospect that it's the opposite of that. It's a way to actually try desperately to continue the tradition, and it's in a way a very political thing. It's a very political music. Because it's attempt to be completely abstract and completely, to say, absolute music. It's now for me clear when you listen to that music that it's in a way super political and super full of meaning and full of it's full of the whole humanity in a way. It's that was a important insight for me, a personal insight, and even though it's a personal interpretation maybe of music history, I think there's something in there that became clear to me, and that it became clear to me that you can't escape context, you can't really escape tradition. So being a composer is also about reflecting on your place in the world and history. It's and that's very much the thing for me. It starts with that kind of reflection. Almost all my pieces does that.
Great. Yeah. I'd like to ask about another piece that deals with similar topics, which would be Transfigurations 4, which is for a string quartet and electronics. Could you tell us a bit about that piece?
Yeah, the starting point is a piece that I wrote called The Three Transfigurations. It's based on, it's like a cycle of string pieces that ends with a piece called Strauss Fragments. And so we had the first piece was 3 Transfigurations, and then I made the Transfiguration 4, and then the Strauss Fragments. And they all relate to Metamorphosen by Richard Strauss. This very moving piece for 23 solo string players, which was the last piece Strauss wrote. And in a way, he lived in the same period as Stefan Zweig. They were friends, they worked together, and they knew each other. They made an opera together. And he also, Richard Strauss, he became, I think, almost 90 years old or something, and he lived through both the world wars and the entire time that Zweig describes in his book, and it was like there was so much going on there, and he was also a complex personality. His music was used by Hitler, and then he writes at the end of at the end of his wife is dead, and at the end of his life, he writes this Metamorphosen, where he looks back to Beethoven, and it's a piece which is called it's a ruin in a way, and then that's the picture he uses when he describes it. And so my starting point was to try to pick up the pieces from this ruin and see if something happened if I tried to reshape the pieces or put them back put them back together in a different way. So it's a way I like to compose in a way. My music has often been called music about music, and I think that's quite precise. It's very often reflections on music and on other people's work, and it's found objects in a way in the tradition that I try to put a different light on and reshape and sometimes completely rewrite, and very often in the form of fragments. I love the form of the fragment, because for me the fragment is in a way it's the form of the memory. I mean, of memory is trying to make logical connections between different fragments in the world, and people that we just partly remember things, and people that we partly remember, and to try to make sense of it all. And for me, music is a good way to make sense of it all in a very non-literal meaning of the word. It's just that ideas, feelings, thoughts come together in a musical composition in a mysterious way that I'm really fascinated by, and it never stops to fascinate me.
And when you're using electronics, such as in this piece, are you doing anything such as using existing recordings to get at that idea of memory, or processing the live sound in any particular way to get at that idea of memory? Or is it in a similar way that you're approaching the acoustic music?
No, I think that's that's a good observation. I very often use electronic to make some kind of reminiscence. So it's very, very often based on delays and reverbs and ways of creating some kind of distance in the music, or perspective on the music, or like a space around the music, like a different perspective, something like that. And what I very often do is that I, like in Transfiguration 4, which was commissioned by the GRM, the ENA GRM in Radio France, it's Pierre Schaeffer's old studio in a way. So I wanted to do that, to take small fragments, small pieces of the live performance and play it back, and very often through delays and reverbs give it slightly changed form, but not entirely changed. So it's kind of floating around itself, the piece, I would say.
Let's listen now to a recording of Lars Petter Hagen's Transfigurations 4, in a recording at ENA GRM Radio France, from a concert at Radio France in Paris, performed by Quatuor Lyonès. So at Other Minds 26th Festival on October 13th through 15th, 2022, you'll be composing a new piece which will be premiered on October 15th, but I know that's still in progress, so I won't ask you about that yet. But festival listeners will also be able to hear some of your existing work, and one of those pieces will be Seven Studies in Sadness. Could you tell us a bit about that piece, which I know exists in a few different versions, so maybe you can tell us about that as well.
Yeah, it's a piece I'm very happy with. It's performed a lot, and it's performed in different versions, as you say, which is the case with many of my pieces. They actually tend to develop into different versions of itself, which in a way is logical, the way I compose, that you can have different outtakes on the same material. So this piece I wrote it in when I was in a residency in Gotland in Sweden. It's a small island outside Stockholm, and I was invited there to work in the beautiful surround studio. And I think it was my first maybe multi-channel electronic piece, and I had no idea what to do. So I was in the beginning of the residency, I was going to the library a lot because they had a beautiful library down by the sea there, by the shore. And next to Gotland, the name of the island, is a slightly smaller island called Fårö. And Fårö is the home of the Swedish film director Ingmar Bergman. So he had his home there for many years, and his workspace and the studio, and the landscape in that area is very beautiful. It's very, I mean, I was also there in the winter. It was like February, so it was like extremely cold, windy, and brutal in many ways. And then I really like this kind of abandoned summer places in the winter because it's very melancholic, because there's something that you can see that is supposed to be there, which is not there. All the people, all the happy people, all the bars, all the ice cream shops, everything is closed, and so you can sense the absence in a very, very concrete way. So that and then I borrowed a lot of Ingmar Bergman movies in the library, DVDs at the time, and I watched them in the studio instead of working, and then combined with different walks around the area there along the coast, I realized that I wanted to somehow have a representation of this very hard surfaces, kind of brutal in a way, but still very organic landscape. So I ended up using 3 kinds of sound material, which is glass, and I also had a lot of wine when I was there, so it was kind of logical because I was drinking wine and watching Bergman movies, and so there's quite a few glass sounds, and there are some and also sine waves, which is basically on the filtered glass sounds, and some completely clean sine waves as well. And then white noise, so it's kind of the basic building blocks of electronic music, and then there are also some piano harmonics from a grand piano that was in the room next door. So it's kind of a super concentrated sound world, but it has been quite defining for me also later, because this is a kind of sound world I always come back to, even when I'm writing orchestra music. It's always kind of like something that appeals to me in a very intuitive way, Yeah. So I imagine the piece as there's this Swedish Bergman movie called Tystnaden, the silence, which is one of the most. I mean, I think it was the biggest commercial success that Ingmar Bergman had, but it's an extremely strange film. It's very quiet. It's super dramatic. It's very cold, even more than normal Bergman movies. Yeah, so basically the music, I imagined the music, and I made the music specifically as as a score to one of the scenes in the film, a very beautiful scene from one of the bedrooms there, which is very quiet, very, very tense, and very, very touching. And it's around 6 minutes. So, I mean, the film was never part of the piece in a way. It was just like a way of using or maybe borrowing the form somehow. And it's not very specifically linked, but it's kind of fits one of the scenes in the film. And so the title is more or less some kind of self, because what happens is when you're sitting in a place like that, in a very melancholic place like that, and you start to feel bad for yourself, right? So it's kind of it's a lot of self-pity in that piece.
I'm sensing a theme. Great. Well, we're definitely looking forward to hearing that at the festival. Let's listen now to an excerpt of Lars Petter's 7 Studies in Sadness. Taking a bit of a turn, I wanted to ask you, you recently began your term as director of the Bergen International Festival. What are your plans for the festival in the upcoming years?
Well, I've just started, so this is now I'm at the office in Bergen, so I've just been here for 3 days, but I'm starting to. I mean, it's a great festival. I was formerly festival director of the Ultima Oslo Contemporary Music Festival for 8 editions, and I've been doing the Nordic Music Days, and I have quite an experience in the contemporary music festival field. And then for 5 years, I've been in the Oslo Philharmonic Orchestra, working with Klaus Mekele and the team there and also working on the digital strategy and their centenary as head of development was the title there. And then the job in Bergen came up, and I was asked to apply and invited into the process. And I've always been a big fan of the Bergen Festival because it's not a contemporary music festival, even though it contains a lot of contemporary music, but it's a classical music festival, and also a performance art festival. It's a lot of dance, it's a lot of theater, it's big productions. It's a budget I'm not used to in contemporary music. So one of the reasons that I really wanted to do this job is that I think it's the perfect place to continue to discover these topics that I'm interested in. The past and present kind of thing. How is this classical music relevant today? What's the connection between the pieces that are written by composers today and the classical tradition? How could giving this music different contexts, shed new light on the pieces, and maybe give us new understandings of some of the work that we're presenting, and also make the festival a meeting place, like a hub for creative partnerships and for exchange of ideas. I mean, there's a quite interesting music scene in Bergen. It's a quite small town, but it's a town that has a lot of great tradition for music. Great composers living here. Even Torben lives here. He comes to San Francisco, I think.
Yes, he's coming in June. Actually, he's coming for a performance of the Exotica album on June 6th.
Yeah. Which is a wonderful work. Recorded by Big 20, which is a Bergen-based ensemble, and so I mean the scene here is quite interesting, and I think there's so much potential for artistic exchange of ideas and for development of new work and also to contextualize traditional work, even folk music. It's a wonderful place for folk music, and it's a beautiful city, and it's one of the most beautiful parts of Norway, with the fjords and everything. So yeah, I can see it as a moment.
Yeah, it looks beautiful. Oh, that's fantastic. You can hear the new premiere of Lars Petter Hagen's as well as some other works of his at the Other Minds Festival 26 on October 15th at the Great Star Theater in San Francisco. Thank you, Lars Petter, for joining me today, and thanks everyone for listening. This has been another episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. Our 26th festival is October 13th through 15th, 2022 at the Great Star Theater in San Francisco.